Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CLI-ALPMA Innovation and Legaltech Week on-demand program. I'm Terri Mottershead, the Executive Director of the Centre for Legal Innovation, and I'm joined by Dr. Larry Ridgett, who is the Principal Consultant at LawyerBrain LLC. We're going to be discussing certainly one of the most topical and I think too one of the most critical issues in legal practice and in the legal industry right now, the importance of resilience in legal practice. And really, I can't think of anyone better that we could chat with about this, literally anywhere in the world, than Larry. So welcome, Larry. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Terri. Delighted to be here.
Larry, I thought we'd kick off by me asking you a little bit about you, so your background, but also how you came to focus on the resilience of lawyers in the work that you do as well. So tell us about you and your work.
Sure. So I'm a lawyer psychologist. I started as a lawyer, practiced for 10 years, really didn't enjoy the practice of law. It was kind of stressful and burnout without what many lawyers find as the compensating positives. So given that it was mostly negative for me, after 10 years, I felt like it was starting to affect my health, and I started looking for something else to do. And I took some time off and did some introspection and realized that there was one very coherent theme that had always been appealing to me, and that was people, to put it simply, or psychology, if you want a more expensive word for the same thing. And so after considering it, I thought I have to go back and get a doctorate in psychology so that I can get some formal credentials to allow me to make some sort of a transition. And initially, I wasn't sure how I was going to do that. But after a lot of reflection, I realized at that point I had invested 10 years of practice, 3 years of law school, and I come from a family of lawyers going back 3 generations. So all my time growing up was, you could argue, spent studying lawyers. And with all of that on the table, I thought it's crazy not to take psychology and marry it to the legal profession in some way. Now, the traditional way that people had done that before me is along the substantive practice of law. So, for example, people who did jury consulting, that's a common thing, or advising lawyers who handle adoption and custody and family law cases. But I wanted to get as far away from the substantive practice of law as I could. And so back then, we didn't have this thing that we call today business of law, the back office, how lawyers work, how you hire lawyers, how you train lawyers, how you take care of lawyers, how you deal with the behavior of the person who goes off when you're done and practices law, leadership, teams, things like fixing dysfunctional behavior. All of that was what I learned about in graduate school and of great interest to me. And so that's what I ended up doing. I studied lawyers, and I developed a deep interest in lawyer personality. In fact, my doctoral research, my dissertation, was a nationwide study of over 3,000 lawyers and their Myers-Briggs preferences. And it was that study that really shaped what I do today. So to bring it back to your question, I found in that study that the people who go into law are dramatically different from the general public, very atypical compared to the average person, and atypical in a very homogeneous way. In other words, the people who go into law are very much like each other and very different from the rest of the world. And that fascinated me. And I thought, this is worth exploring further. And fast forward, it's now close to 30 years since I did that study. And I have over, I've lost count. It's at least 25, 30,000 sets of data, maybe closer to 40,000 sets of data on lawyers. And they all tell the same story. We're very different from the public and very similar to each other. in ways that make sense to equip us to practice law better. And we'll get into that in a bit, I think, because of the questions I know you're going to ask later on. But that's what started the career, the fascination with what makes us tick.
Hmm. Larry, do you think that, and this is a question that that I get asked, but it picks up on what you were saying, and I'm sure you've been asked it a million more times, and that is, have you found that that personality has held true even with the current batch of lawyers, if you like, that are coming into leadership positions? So in other words, sometimes I guess there's a comment that's made, the work was done, some time ago, but does that still apply as much to lawyers that are coming through now? And I think your answer to that is yes, because you mentioned you've done it over that and kind of updated it and revisited it over that time. But I wanted to just draw that question out in particular because it does come up a bit.
So it's a great question, Terry, and it would make sense if the types of personalities that were coming into the legal profession were to change because the profession has changed. But the surprise is it hasn't changed at all. The personality data that I see, in fact, I just tested a couple people this week, a couple lawyers this week, and the profile looks exactly the same as what I've seen for the last 27 years with this one test that I use. And arguably, what we need today in terms of a more well-rounded, what we need is a more well-rounded lawyer. We need lawyers that have certain skills that weren't important 25 years ago. We need leadership skills. We need the ability to think globally and to understand people from diverse cultures in a way we didn't really need when the world was smaller 25 years ago. And there are a couple of other things that we probably need, maybe some entrepreneurial skills, more innovation skills, and so forth. But we're not seeing personality adjustments to match that. And I don't know if that's because the law schools haven't really changed who they pick and the pool is already kind of calcified, or that the end users, the law firms and the legal departments in companies just really haven't updated their database in terms of what do we need. And truth be told, lawyers usually think of more concrete criteria when they're hiring people, like what are your grades in law school and have you done this type of work, as opposed to what is your personality. And so it wouldn't surprise me if people have been inattentive to this, despite the fact that it's a very, very significant variable in performance. So the short answer to your question is we're seeing the same basic personality come through today that we've always seen, with one change. I'm going to tantalize your listeners and viewers and tell you what that one change is when we get into the actual personality traits.
All right. Okay. More to come. Yeah, absolutely. The subject of what we're chatting about today, I guess, is pulling out just one of those traits, the one around resilience. And I'm sure that folks listening now will probably think, well, we know what resilience means. Everybody has their own definition of resilience, I guess. But I imagine that it's shaped quite a bit by our own experiences in terms of defining it. So I should ask you this question to kind of lay the groundwork for a few more questions that will come. And that is, how do you define resilience?
So I really define it in two ways, and we're going to move to the next question, actually, in order to answer your first one. I think of resilience as having both a big R, capital R resilience, and a little r type of resilience. The big R resilience is the one that most people think of when you say the word, and it's what researchers originally looked at. It has to do with when human beings are subjected to enormous pressure, like trauma, car accident, house burns down, you're injured in some way, you suffer a loss of a loved one. In those trying moments, when we are subjected to unbearable difficulties, it's always, we always see stories that remind us that human beings have big R resilience. We bounce back very, very well from hardship, even though we think if we had to predict it, we say, no, I could never do that. Oh, you know, what you did, that's amazing, but I could never do that. And then you suffer the same thing and you surprise yourself how much strength you have to return to some state of normalcy. So resilience in its core meaning of the word is bouncing back. And I think it's taken from the concept in physics that a spring or a piece of metal, when you bend it, it wants to go back to its original shape. It's resilient because it pops back. But there's a more narrow kind of everyday use of the word resilience, and I call that little r resilience. And what that refers to is things that have to do with how we deal with criticism or rejection or the day-to-day little setbacks in life, the insults that we suffer. Can be a very insignificant thing. You know, someone calls you by the wrong name, and a highly resilient person doesn't even notice it perhaps, but a low resilience person may feel hurt and wounded, like, you know, they attach all this meaning. Oh, you didn't remember my name. Ouch, what does that mean? Don't you like me? You know, and things like that. So little r resilience has to do with really how we respond to mainly criticism, but also rejection. Somebody plans a meeting and you're supposed to be on the list and you don't get included. You know, that's a form of rejection that triggers little r resilience, or, you know, low resilience, the absence of resilience. Something doesn't work. You do a presentation and it doesn't go well. You just know it in your bones. That's a low R resilience situation. So those are all examples of little R resilience. And there is a test that I use called the caliper profile that directly measures little R resilience. There are also some more research-based tools that measure big R resilience. But I'm going to talk the rest of today about little r.
Yeah. And I want to get into lawyers and resilience specifically in just a sec, but I just wanted to stay with this for a moment and just, I guess, round this out by asking, is resilience something that can be learned, or are we hardwired? Is it almost genetic, or is it a bit of a mix of both, do you think?
So one of the things that psychologists have learned these days is that anytime someone asks you about learned versus genetic, the answer is always, no matter what you're talking about, it's always both. And there's developing neuroscience on this. In fact, there's a book by a neuroscientist named Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's a professor of psychology, I believe, at Northeastern University in Boston. And she has really done some interesting research in neuroscience and has shown that this distinction of genetic versus learned is actually somewhat artificial, because everything about human beings draws on both learned and genetic regions in our brain and learned and genetic experiences. So it's both. Now, any given thing can be more toward one end of that spectrum or more toward the other. Everybody is certainly born with a set point for resilience. Some people are just born bulletproof, and other people are born very vulnerable and thin-skinned. But to answer the first way you phrased the question, can it be learned? Yes, we can learn definitely to build our resilience. So I myself started with a 19% on this scale that I mentioned when I took the test 27 years ago. And now I'd say I'm somewhere in the vicinity of 85. Some people have said you must be over 90.
Wow.
Because I've really built it up over that time. Now, 27 years is a long time, but most of that building up was in the first 5 years that I gave it a try. So it definitely can be built, and can be built quite significantly.
And I think an important point to underscore that is possible, particularly now where we find ourselves kind of still in the middle of a pandemic, right, with so many things being thrown at us. But let me turn to a bit of a focus on lawyers and resilience. And as you were saying earlier on, you know, you have just an amazing body of work in lawyer personality and characteristics. And I just wanted to take 1 second both to say that, but also to recognise it, Larry, because it is just an incredible amount of work that you've done. It has included, obviously, a very deep dive into lawyers and resilience. So I guess the obvious first question here is, where do lawyers sit on the scale, or maybe it's a continuum of low to high resilience, and why do you think they are where they are on that scale?
So let's start with the idea that resilience, the way I'm talking about it today, is considered a personality trait. A personality trait is basically a quality or a characteristic of a human being that has to do with how we think or feel. And it tends to be stable over time. So it characterizes the individual. So somebody who is high on a trait, you see that trait in their behavior. When the proper conditions arise that triggers that particular trait being needed, it will show up. And someone who's low in that trait, you'll see the opposite. And usually what we see is the behavior that trait is manifesting. So an example is, let's take a different trait to make it more easier to see. There's a trait called urgency. So high urgent people like myself, we're pretty impatient. We tend to finish other people's sentences. We are always tapping our toe. We're wanting to get on with it. Low urgency people are very laid back and deliberate, and they like to think things through. They don't want to rush to judgment. So if you think about that trait alone, the trait is an internal feeling, but the way it manifests, let's take high urgency. A high urgency person has a feeling inside that they need closure. But the way that looks to an outside observer is, oh, Larry seems to finish other people's sentences, or he's always, rolling through a stop sign. So it manifests in behavior, but the behavior is not the trait. The trait is the internal feeling or thought that leads to that behavior. So resilience is basically, it starts as a set point that's learned, and then, that's genetic. And there is always some learning. There's some learning when you grow up that can increase or decrease your resilience. And then, so I'll call that accidental learning. And then we can actually coach people who want to build their resilience up and intentionally raise that resilience through coaching or through a training program where we do it with multiple people and raise it in that way.
And how would, with resilience, you gave us some great examples around urgency. How would we know, or how would a low resilience, manifest itself versus a high resilience manifest itself?
So let's start with the high resilience person. A high resilience individual, again, when they are criticized or rejected, or when they have a setback of some sort, either it doesn't affect them at all. It just kind of is like water off a duck's back. They just go, yeah, whatever. It doesn't affect them. Or they feel a slight twinge and then they bounce back. They just get back on the horse and they don't lose any sleep over it. They're right back, in the swing of things. So I have a client I work with who is the COO of a major global law firm. And she has an extraordinarily high resilience score. It's not 100, but it's extraordinarily high. And I should say, personality traits are measured when you're using an industrial strength, more sophisticated assessment like the caliper. They're measured on a percentile scale. So that means 0 to 100%. And what that percent is really representing is your comparison to a norm group. let's say the general public or a subset of the general public. So if you look at any database of people, like Caliper has a database of about 6-7 million people they've tested over the last 50 plus years, every one of the traits that they measure is going to be measured along this scale of 0 to 100. But when you aggregate and you look at this huge database, high and low scores cancel each other out, and we get what statisticians call a regression to the mean, which means every trait averages for the population and the general population at 50%. So that's our starting point. We expect scores to be around 50%, and any score that's higher or lower than 50%, we go, oh, well, isn't that interesting? This person is more urgent than the public or less resilient than the public. So we start at that baseline 50%. When you measure a smaller group, like an occupation, 7 million people, that's hundreds of different occupations. But if you just took a couple hundred people from a single occupation, would every one of their scores on every trait average at 50%? No, it would be, some would be a little higher, some would be a little lower, because there's always some influence, certain traits influence people who go into that occupation. But there's some guardrails. We call it the standard deviation. Traits are unlikely to average for a group below 40% or above 60%. Anytime a trait falls below 40 or above 60, that's headline news. That's something we should pay attention to because it's very rare. And so keep that in mind, because in a minute we're going to talk about lawyers, and I'll say something shocking that has to do with that. But let's return to this question of somebody who is high or low in resilience. What does it look like? So a high resilience person, somebody who is, let's say, in the top 20 to 30%, 70%, 80%, even 90%. That person is going to be pretty tough-minded, hard to make feel bad. I had one lawyer who was an IP lawyer, and he had a 95% resilience score. Very unusual for a person in general and quite unusual for a lawyer. And I said to him, what's it like when somebody criticizes you? Because I was actually genuinely interested as a person who had a 19. I thought, I can't imagine what a 95 is like. And here's what he said to me. He said, what's it like when somebody criticizes me? I guess it means somebody else has a problem. Now, I mean, I would not have thought of that answer in a million years, but that's a high resilience answer. So low resilience, what do low resilience people do? Quite the opposite. The low resilience person, you don't even have to say something critical, but let's start with that and I'll give you an illustration. So if somebody criticizes you, the first thing that low resilience people usually do is they feel hurt or wounded. And then they might say something defensive. Let me explain. Oh, see, you don't understand. The reason I did that, you don't want to just, accept the criticism like the high resilience person who could care less. You want to fix the person's impression that they have of you. You want to say, no, wait, you don't understand. You've got me all wrong. I'm not that bad person you've just described. And you want to fix the criticism. And that's usually impossible. And in fact, it kind of shows vulnerability to the critic and makes it even tougher for the low resilience person. But wait, it gets worse. So after we get defensive and start explaining ourselves, sometimes you'll see denial. Oh, I didn't do that. I would never do that. You'll see deflection. Terry, could we talk about this Monday? I don't think I really have time to discuss this now. And then you'll see counterattacking. Oh, you think I did something? Let me tell you what you did. Anything that I can do to get the heat off of me, I will do to avoid the bad feeling that a low resilience person feels. Now, for the final straw, some people are so low in resilience, you don't even have to criticize them to bring out these behaviors. So for example, if I say, do you know what time it is? A high resilience person will say, yeah, it's 4:15. A low resilience person might say something like, what are you saying? You're saying that I'm not working fast enough, right? Or my favorite is, we're walking down the main street of your favorite city and we pass by a beautiful clothing boutique. And I look in the window and I see this beautiful outfit and I say, Terry, look at that outfit. You'd look smashing in that. If you're high in resilience, you say, thank you, because it was a compliment, of course. But if you're a really low resilience person, what do you say? You say, you don't like what I'm wearing? That's low resilience.
All right, so hit me with it. Where are lawyers falling, generally speaking, in all of this?
So remember, the public is at 50%, and it's your classic bell curve with 40 and 60, the boundaries where 2/3 of the public are going to fall between 40 and 60. Lawyers average at 30%. And this has been the most stable personality trait of all the traits I measure for lawyers. This aberrant score of 30% has not varied a fraction of a point in 27 years. It's just been rock steady. And every time I test a group of lawyers, I just tested a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, a large insurance company with a global legal department. We had several hundred lawyers. The average resilience score for the group was 28.8%. Just inches away from 30%. I mean, it's just, this is the norm in the profession. So that's not the full story. It's not only 20% lower than the norm, 30% compared to 50, but it's not your typical bell curve. It's a skewed bell curve. So what that means is everybody is, it's like you tilted the bell curve and everybody fell to the basement. 90% of the lawyers that I test, year after year after year, 90% of the lawyers have a resilience score in the lower half of the scale.
Wow. Wow. And is this the kind of one aberrant trait that you were talking about before as well? It's resilience?
No, it's not the one aberrant trait. That's all the aberrant traits for lawyers are like this. So let's go to that for a second, and then I'll explain, because I know you're going to ask me, why are lawyers so low? But let's digress for a moment, and we'll come back to that curious question. Okay. So one of the things that has surprised and delighted me over all these years, and one of the reasons that I have spent so much time testing lawyers, and particularly with this test, the caliper profile, I've used a number of different tests over the years, and all of them show that lawyers are atypical. The people who go into law just are different from other people. But caliper really highlights this. And for years, I saw 6 of the 18 traits as outliers. That is, the average person, when they take the caliper, they get feedback about 18 different unique independent personality traits, all relevant to how you operate in the workplace. And every one of those traits in Caliper's database averages for the public at 50%. You would expect lawyers to be not quite 50%, maybe they'd be lower or higher, but you wouldn't expect them to go below 40 or above 60. But what I've consistently found is that 7 of the 18 traits, and for years it was 6 of the 18 traits, were outliers. 4 of them are above average, above 60, and 2 of them were below average. Now we have a 7th trait that is also below average. So we have 4 above and 3 below, 4 above 60 and 3 of them below 40. So what are those traits?
Yeah, you got to tell us. Come on.
All right. So number 1 is skepticism.
Yeah.
The average skepticism score for lawyers is not 50%. It's not 60%. It's above 60. It's 90%. 90%. The technical term for that, Terry, is friggin' unbelievable. And the reason that lawyers are so high in skepticism is because it is their stock and trade. It is an essential, indispensable, necessary trait for practicing high quality law. because you have to protect your clients. And for that, you have to be vigilant about assertions people make and about information and about motives of people. So skepticism is the kind of thing that lawyers do to be good lawyers. And it's natural that if that's what you do every day, people with that personality trait would feel much more comfortable in such an occupation than people who don't have a lot of skepticism. And so low skeptics actually tend to drop out of law school at a higher rate, so that by the time people graduate, higher skepticism is already concentrated. And most personality traits are more genetic than learned, so they don't change that much over time. But skepticism is an exception. It is a learned trait. So is resilience, by the way. And so the more time people spend in a skeptical environment, the more skeptical they become. Right. The second outlier trait is abstract reasoning. Lawyers love to learn, to analyze, to stimulate their large brains, and to argue. So lawyers tend to argue a lot. Of course, you're supposed to say, no, we don't.
But I was a practicing lawyer, so
that's why I said it. So it's just a trait that we love to do. We love to analyze things in a very logical way and then argue about them. That's abstract reasoning. We're way above the public on that. We have an 89% abstract reasoning score. 81% abstract reasoning score compared to 50% for the public. Number 3 is high urgency. We have a 71% urgency score instead of 50. We're impatient. We want to cut to the chase. We want to get the work done for our client. The clients, of course, want us to be responsive, but it's a perfect fit because the lawyers are designed to be impatient. And then the fourth trait is we have extraordinarily high autonomy. We don't want people telling us what to do. Now, it's normal for human beings to want some autonomy, but lawyers have taken it to an art form. We basically do not want anyone telling us what to do. And so the way the practice of law has evolved, even in very large firms, is most lawyers have their own individual book of business and their own practice, and they can go and do what they want. And it's very hard to hold them accountable for anything because of this high autonomy need. The 3 traits that are below average, the first of them is low sociability. So lawyers are very awkward and uncomfortable with intimacy. High sociability people are open and interested in developing authentic connections with people. They're comfortable with being vulnerable and sharing private things with another person to deepen the connection. A low resilience person would have left the room before I finished my previous sentence because it contained words like authentic, vulnerable, connection. Those are all trigger words for a low resilience, a low sociability person that make them feel very uncomfortable. Low sociability people are private. They are a relationship averse, I would call it. They don't like talking about relationships. They see them as touchy-feely, which is really quite unfortunate because the science on relationships that's come out in the last 15 years shows that relationships are super important for well-being, for boosting your immune system, for healthy relationships, for all kinds of things that matter to people. And people who don't place a lot of importance on relationships suffer more. They have lower resilience, by the way. It affects resilience. So sociability is an important trait, and yet lawyers are very low in this. The average is 12%. And by the way, autonomy, I didn't give you the numbers for that. Autonomy is up at 89%. So the next trait, of course, is resilience. We've already talked about those numbers. And then the last trait, the one I said I would hold the oddball trait till last. This is oddball because for years, this trait was not an outlier. It was close. it always averaged at 41%. Remember, an outlier has to be above 60 or below 40. So 41% is inside that range. So technically speaking, I couldn't call it an outlier, but it's been dropping the last few years. And the trait is called cognitive empathy. The ability to take the perspective of another person, to shift into thinking, I know what I want. What does Terri want? How is what I'm doing or saying going to affect Terri? When I schedule something, Tuesday at 4 would be good for me. How is it for you? Perspective taking. That's dropping like a stone, not just among lawyers, but among millennials around the world. And no one knows why exactly, but I have a hypothesis. This is unscientifically proven, but it makes some sense. When people learn empathy, we learn as kids. We play in the schoolyard historically. And if I play in the schoolyard and I call you a name or I playfully punch you and I see that you feel hurt by that, a typical kid will make a course correction. Oh, I see you're hurt. I didn't mean to hurt you. And the next time I won't hit you as hard or I won't call you that name. Yes, there are some mean kids that won't make that adjustment, but most people, they don't like to inflict pain on other people. And so they make an adjustment and they learn empathy in that way. But starting with the mid-millennials, the early millennials born in 80, 82, this wasn't true for, but when you get to people born around 1993, 1994, and on up, they went through their formative years never knowing a time that was without texting. Earlier generations, texting didn't exist and they learned about it at some point. But for the latter millennials, they never didn't know texting. And the main way that they communicated was texting. Texting has no visual, no emotions are conveyed. So everything is just flat textual data. And if that's how you communicate, if you call somebody a name, you never see the pain on their face. And so one possibility here is that this generation grew up without the usual experiences that form empathy, and so it's quite low. And we don't even know for sure. Empathy is the third trait. Remember I said that most personality traits are more genetic than learned. There are three exceptions. Skepticism is more learned, resilience is more learned than genetic, and empathy is more learned than genetic. So most people, in my experience, can learn to increase their empathy skills. But we don't know if somebody who has grown up with almost no empathy can learn it. If I take somebody who's got a 50, I could bring them up to a 70. But if I take somebody who's a 10, I don't know if they're subject to improvement. I haven't had that, luckily haven't had that coaching assignment yet, and haven't talked to anyone who has. So the jury is still out about that.
It might be by the sounds of it.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to find out. I'm sure somebody's going to study that, but we don't know. So I mentioned all of that because I thought it was helpful background to know what the typical outlier traits are for lawyers. That was a good slip of the tongue. We should call them outlawyer traits. But now we can go back to our question. So why are lawyers so low in resilience? Well, for years, this was a puzzlement to me. I just couldn't figure it out. I looked high and low. I couldn't find anything in the research literature. I couldn't find anything in the personality research. And then a marvelous thing happened. Around 2013, the US Army found out that the University of Pennsylvania was doing research on resilience. And by the way, I had actually discovered that same thing myself a few years earlier than the Army did, quite by accident. I sat in, my wife and I are both psychologists, and we went to a continuing ed. We were intending to go to a continuing ed psychology conference in Philadelphia, where we live. and we walked into the wrong hotel. And we didn't realize we walked into the wrong hotel because there were placards all over about a psychology conference. It just wasn't the one that we thought we were going to. And we walked into this conference, and it was Marty Seligman who created the field of positive psychology. And he was lecturing about positive psychology. And he was talking about resilience. And I remember being captivated by it. And it's why I joined IPA, the International Positive Psychology Association, as one of the early members, because I just completely fell into it by happenstance. Well, around 2013, the Army discovered this, and they reached out to Marty at the University of Pennsylvania and asked if he wouldn't create a program for them to train soldiers, all soldiers around the world for the US, in resilience skills, because soldiers face some pretty hair-raising triggers for low resilience, you know, getting shot at and being in harm's way in other ways. And many of them come out depressed or having post-traumatic stress disorder. And Seligman believed, based on his research, that he could move the whole bell curve to the right, that the really severely traumatized soldiers could be trained to cope better with their stressors, and that people who were average could be built into more highly resilient people, and so forth. And I was fascinated by this idea. And one of the things the Army does really well is research. So they started publishing some and talking at seminars about some of these studies. And one of the things I came upon is research showing that while little our resilience can be built up in a number of different ways, the two main things that build it up are, number one, cognitive reframing or cognitive strategies, how we think, mainly what we say to ourselves when we suffer a setback. And you can think of that as optimistic thinking, because people who think pessimistically tend to have lower resilience, and people who think optimistically have higher resilience. Now, I'm not talking about optimism like blind optimism. Everything's going to be wonderful. This is more, okay, you did poorly on that test in school. The low resilience person catastrophizes and says, oh my God, I failed the test. No one will ever give me a good grade again. I'm going to flunk out of school. I'll never get a good job. And it's downward from there. Whereas an optimistic response might be something more, actually more realistic, like, okay, I didn't do well on the test, but maybe that can actually serve as an incentive for me to study harder next time. Or I didn't do well on the test, but I've had setbacks before and I'm sure I'll bounce back. Or I got a bad score, but I'm so good at all these other things and I get constant reinforcement for the things I'm good at. In the overall scheme of things, it's not such a big deal. Those are three different optimistic responses to the very same setback that a low resilience person caves in at. And I started listening to this idea that you could just help people start telling different stories, different voices in your head, different, sound bites about what it means to have a setback. And if you change the internal dialogue, the genius of, let's go back a few years to the 1970s, the genius of Aaron Beck and his discovery of cognitive behavioral therapy, the central discovery in that therapy is it's our thoughts that dictate our feelings. And if you can listen in and learn what thoughts are going through your head, and particularly which thoughts are triggering an undesirable emotion, you can then change those thoughts and then rehearse the new thoughts so that it automates. And by that method, you can build somebody's resilience. You can help people heal from clinical depression. You can improve people who have insomnia. There's a whole bunch of things you can do by adjusting their thinking patterns. So the one thing that the number one technique that we use when we build the resilience of people is we help them listen into their soundtrack and then find sabotaging thoughts that might have triggered a low resilience response and adjust it, help them learn new ways to edit that thinking and then burn in the new thinking so that it becomes the de facto way that they respond in the future. So that's thing one, optimism or pessimism. And number two is social connection. So I mentioned earlier that people who have strong, authentic connections tend to be more resilient than other people. But it's not just a static thing. You can build connections and by doing so, build your resilience. So it's a little harder than changing the cognitive strategies, but there's research evidence that you can teach at least certain people to build their connections, build their intimacy and authenticity. And by doing so, you feel plugged into a network that's supportive, you feel part of a community. And when you have a setback, you bounce back quicker. You don't get as low in the first place. So social connection. Now, here was the big insight. If the two main things that regulate and help us build high resilience are optimistic thinking and social connection, let's see where lawyers are in that. Oh my God, they're the worst on both of those things. We're highly skeptical, which is not exactly the same as optimism or pessimism, but it's a first cousin and it travels parallel. People who are skeptical or trusting are optimistic for the most part. So this highly, highly skeptical group of people are also pretty pessimistic. So they're not benefiting at all to build their resilience. How about social connection? Well, again, 12% sociability. Lawyers just are not benefiting from building their resilience in any way from the kind of avoidant style they have when it comes to relationships. And it's harder, in my experience, to teach low sociable lawyers to build connections than it is to help them adjust their cognitions, because lawyers are very cognitive. It's one of our strengths. It's one of the things we do well, and teaching them to adjust their cognitive strategies is a pretty low-hanging fruit exercise for lawyers. So that's the main way that we teach lawyers to build resilience.
Larry, I want to take all of those characteristics that you were speaking about, and obviously with a bit of a focus on resilience, but as we look at the legal ecosystem and particularly lawyers within that ecosystem globally, and we look at the business of law as well and how much that is changing, the newer iterations of law firms and I guess allied professions and professionals in the ecosystem, at the core of the way that, or characteristics of those entities tend to be things like design thinking, which focuses on defined empathy, on experimenting, if you like, in collaboration with a lot of people. So there's the sociability part, inside and outside, and experimentation by its very nature, and it's part of design thinking as well, I guess, is that you might fail. You might fail often. And there has to be an ability to, firstly, not have a fear of failure, but to bounce back from that and try something really quite different. We're increasingly seeing that movement around the growth mindset, so really being open to doing things quite differently. So if we look at all of those characteristics that you've described, and I'm not going to go into all of them because I know that folks listening to this will be connecting the dots. And let's say for a second that we need to change, because a lot of that change in the industry is coming about because our clients and our employees are really requiring a quite different workplace, but also a quite different way to receive legal services and products. So there's an external and an internal part around, pushing for this change. How are we going to get it done? I mean, how are we going to innovate? Because obviously this is a session in a conference on innovation and legal tech, but how is that going to happen when that lawyer personality and the characteristics and traits that you've been speaking to seem to be almost the antithesis of all of those things that we may have to move towards in terms of particularly the business, but I imagine the practice of law as well.
So I'm sure you use the word almost, Terry, because you and I are both trained as lawyers and you wanted to hedge your bets there, but it is not almost the antithesis, it is the antithesis. In fact, I would go so far as to say the average lawyer is perfectly designed not to innovate.
Yeah.
Design thinking is a foreign substance to the average lawyer. A couple of points. First, we're talking about averages, and so most lawyers have some of these traits. When you look at all lawyers aggregated, these are the traits that pop out. But not every lawyer has every trait in every extreme fashion. So there are some lawyers, maybe you have a lawyer who's highly skeptical, but who's pretty resilient, or you have somebody who's resilient, but not that skeptical, or vice versa. So there are some lawyers who, because they don't have every one of these traits at an extreme, might not be in as bad a shape as we imagine if we think of all of these traits as a group. Secondly, it is very challenging to think of taking lawyers and getting them to innovate because, face it, we really are designed for just the opposite. I mean, start with risk averse, right? We always hear people, lay people, say lawyers are risk averse, and it looks that way. My research actually shows that we're not risk averse. There is actually a trait on the caliper that measures avoidance of risk, and lawyers score just like a bell curve, like the public. Some lawyers are risk averse, some are not. But almost every lawyer that I interact with, and most people that tell me when they hear what I do, they say, whoa, lawyers, they're really risk averse. And it feels that way to me too. So why do my data show that we're not risk averse, but my eyes and ears tell me that we are risk averse? And I think the answer is what we're seeing looks just like risk aversion, which comes from actually a trait called cautiousness. People who are highly cautious don't want to get it wrong. They don't want to make a mistake. That's your true risk averse person. And they will be risk averse till the day they die, and they'll be risk averse in every quarter of their life. Whereas a low resilience person, I think low resilience is really the root that makes people behave like they're low risk averse. So let me give you an example. If I said to you, I want you to present something without any preparation, I want you to wing it in front of a client. As a lawyer, I can predict most lawyers' response to that invitation. No way, I'm not doing it. I want time to prepare. I do not want to go into that client meeting unprepared. Is that because I'm risk averse? No, it's because I know that if I go in there unprepared and I make a mistake, my low resilience will kick in and I will feel awful. How about if I said, I've got a shiny new sports car and I'm going to give it to you and I'm going to let you drive it under two conditions. Condition one, I'm going to be sitting right next to you. And condition two, you can drive it without anybody sitting next to you. Under condition one, you're going to drive it in a very risk-averse way because you don't want to get criticized by the guy sitting next to you. But when nobody's looking, vroom, vroom, you know, there you are pulling a double clutch and getting it into fifth gear and winding it out. That's because, and if you compare that behavior, that's a person who's not at risk of being criticized in the latter scenario, but let's put instead a highly cautious person, a risk-averse person in the driver's seat. You put them there alone, they're still going to drive cautiously because that's their nature. Mm. So cautiousness or risk aversion is a bit of a red herring. Lawyers look like they're risk averse, but it's coming from low resilience and the fear of getting criticized for making a mistake than it is coming from true fear of the mistake itself. It's a subtle distinction, but it's an interesting one. Now, having said that, lawyers tend to be risk averse, whether it's resilience caused or, cautiousness caused. And so when you try to get them to innovate, innovation is kind of another version of here's a sports car. Do you want to do this scary thing where you try by definition, innovating is try something that's never been done before. Well, what could possibly go wrong there with a person who's afraid of making a mistake, right? So the low resilience lawyer never wants to innovate. And when you do force them to innovate, what do they come up with? They come up with things that they've already done. In fact, what do they ask you? I don't know if you get this, but as a consultant, here's one of the most common questions I hear from clients. Well, what have other firms done?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wait a minute, didn't you just tell me you wanted to innovate so that you could differentiate yourself from other firms, but now you're asking what other firms have done? Yeah. It makes no sense unless you understand the personality dynamics, which is you don't really want to innovate. You want to do something safe where you know what it's going to turn out like. So how do you get somebody to truly innovate? How do you get them to take that step into the void and try something that's truly untried? And the answer is you have to build their resilience first, because the low resilience is at the root of this, and it can be done. Luckily, as I said earlier, it's a learned score, a learned trait. So you can teach people first to build their resilience, and then they can do true innovation, not kind of faux innovation that looks like innovation but isn't really.
Yeah. And I guess that, which we're seeing probably in those firms that are focusing on this, it's kind of almost building the innovation muscle in a way, absolutely consistent with what you're saying. Do those things that are most comfortable, look at them, see and get comfortable with them, then build to the next, then build to the next. So it's more of a evolution as opposed to like, boom, let's change.
That's right. And in fact, Terri, you remind me of one of my favorite books, which I forget the exact title. I think it's called In the Box Thinking. And it's by a guy, again, whose name escapes me, but he was at Johnson & Johnson internally. He worked there. I forget his role, some management role. And he discovered that engineers who are very similar to lawyers, they're relatively low in resilience and, don't like making mistakes. It was hard to get them to innovate until he discovered that if he gave them a little bit of a head start by structuring the situation, instead of complete blue sky, just, go into a room and just let's brainstorm, which is scary to a person who's risk averse. What he did is he said, let me give you kind of a framework that helps you try moving one part around in this framework at a time, but the rest of it is familiar to you. So for example, he did a thing with General Electric. He left Johnson & Johnson, became a consultant, and as a consultant, he was hired by GE. And he took a group of GE engineers, this is a true story, and he said to them, let's start by just making a list of all the products that are really best sellers, and let's pick one of those best sellers. And they came up with refrigerators. GE makes a ton of refrigerators. The goal here is to innovate, to do something we've never done before. And of course, the engineers are like, no, anything but that. So he said, what we're going to do is think of what's the most important component that makes up a refrigerator. Well, they agreed on it. They said it's the compressor. All right, so let's now put on our structured innovation hat, and we're going to pretend that we have a refrigerator that's normal in every way, except we're going to take the compressor and get rid of it. Or we're going to at least take it out of the refrigerator. What do you got? Now, they're working with something that's very familiar to them. It's a refrigerator. They understand everything about it. All the parts they know are in the refrigerator except this one thing. And what did they come up with? Some genius in this group realized that if you put the compressor outside the refrigerator, you could actually, the compressor is the part that generates the most heat. You could put that outside, then all the heat would be outside. You wouldn't have to cool it down as much inside. You could make it much, much smaller. And they invented the so-called refrigerator drawer. It's just a drawer that you put in your kitchen that cools things, and the guts of it that do the actual cooling are outside, and it sends the cool air through a thin tube. So you can have, and now new homes often are routinely built. The high-end homes are built with these drawers that are refrigerator drawers. And they invented that because this guy trained the engineers how to think inside the box. Mm. So that same technique, and there's a whole bunch of other structure. There are 5 different techniques that he developed, which are in this book, which take a given known product in this case, but you could do it with a service or an idea. They take a known product, and then they have some rules about how to blow it up, how to adjust it according to one of these 5 alternate frameworks, and then get people to brainstorm with these as the ground rules. And people like lawyers and engineers can really innovate under these conditions in ways that they wouldn't under blue sky conditions.
Absolutely. And I guess, and build that comfort level in a way that, I know you've expressed that slightly differently, but build that at the same time. Larry, I could quite happily chat with you for many, many hours to come, but I have to bring it to a close. It's just been a fascinating discussion, and again, just amazing to be able to draw from you and through you from that amazing body of work that you have. So thank you so much for joining us today. Just as always, an absolute pleasure. For those of you that are listening to this session, thank you, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm sure that you did. You will find Larry at his website, LawyerBrain, but also on social media. So do connect with him and follow up with him on any of the many amazing things that we've chatted about today. And if you'd like to receive updates about the work of CLI and ALPMA, also please do follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. And on that note, again, Larry, thank you so much. And I really look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, Terry. The pleasure is all mine.